What has been the effect of income taxation and the IRS that enforces it? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the good principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you, and of course, to be with our viewers and listeners. It's always a pleasure to spend time with them. That's a
Yeah,
different matter.
yeah, no, I know the feeling, know the feeling. Okay, so Richard, this week is income tax week on Tuesday. That was the infamous deadline where everybody gets all freaked out and panicky and everything, and rightly so. I don't want to mock any of this because if you don't file your return on time or pay your taxes on time, we all know what happens. And if you persist in doing so, you find yourself in a federal hoosgow. But ordinarily, you get hit with fines and penalties and excess interest and so forth. So everybody's getting their returns or getting their extensions in on April 15th. And so I thought we ought to revisit this issue. You and I have talked about this issue sometimes in the past, but I think it's really important to revisit it because I think it goes to the heart of the serfdom society in which we live. When, Americans live without income taxation in the IRS for more than 100 years, until 1913. So it's the founding of the United States, 1788 or 89, all the way through the 1800s and then 1913. Americans live without this. I mean, imagine keeping everything you earn 100% and being able to save a large portion of it and invest it and build it up into a nice nest egg. I mean, if you just calculate the amount of income taxes you paid for the last 10 years or 20 years, it's a large sum of money for most people that is just gone. And our American ancestors didn't have to deal with that. They kept 100% of their income. Now, of course, they also didn't have the welfare state or the warfare state, the drug war. They didn't have paper money, Federal Reserve that plunders and loots people as well. So the federal government was very, very small. The things that they needed to fund were tiny, and that's why they didn't have a big income tax. But it's really not the fact that they take so much money out of people's income as much as it is a destruction of freedom. I mean, this is what our American ancestors understood, that if you live in a society where the government's able to seize large portions of your income and they set the percentage, you're not a free person. You're a little serf. You're a serf on an allowance. Now, the way they have it set up, it makes it look like, oh, you're sending in your taxes. Actually, the reality is they're letting you keep a certain percentage of your income, and they're deciding what that is. So in a sense, it's like a child on an allowance. A parent is giving the allowance to the child and saying, here, you can have this to go out and buy your comic books and whatever. And that's really what this income tax system is based on. It's an allowance by which the government can set the percentage. If they set a percentage of 95%, that's it. People will work 5% for themselves and 95% for the government. So it really is a system of serfdom, or if you even want to be more precise, a system of slavery. I mean, that you're having to live and work for the good of the government, to serve the government. That's where we now live as a result of this income tax, a society in which people exist to serve the government, to work for the government. And that is not a free society. It's like a beehive where everybody is, playing his part in the betterment of the hive. And if somebody says, I'm done with this, you're not going to take my money anymore, boy, that bee becomes a threat to the hive. And they deal with him. They say, we need to re-educate him. We need to put him in the penitentiary and until he gets his head straight, that he is part of the hive and he exists to serve the greater good of the hive. Well, that's not a free society. And our ancestors understood this. And like I've said before, my favorite time in history is from like 1880 to 1910, where there was no income tax, no minimum wage, no economic regulations, Federal Reserve, paper money, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare state, foreign wars in Asia and Africa and Europe. And it just a remarkable period and the most prosperous period. That's the thing, and the most charitable period that mankind had ever seen. So that's what we just have to keep working toward, Richard, is raising people's vision as to why this is such a horrendous system. Not just because of the amount of money that they extract out of people's wealth and income, diminishing their overall standard of living, but the fact that it has turned us into a serfdom society. What do you think?
Well, I, of course, look forward to the pleasure of paying my taxes. I only wish the government made me more of a serf. But we were just talking before we began the program about when Tax Freedom Day is this year. That is when, in principle, does the average American stop working to pay their taxes and metaphorically at least just be working for themselves. And it turns out, at least according to a Google search, that happens this year on June 12th. Well, this is April 15th. We have almost 2 more months to be working for the government before we've paid what the government would consider our tax liability for the year to then metaphorically be just working for ourselves for the rest of the calendar year. This is outrageous. If you consider that the founding fathers in colonial America revolted over a few pennies on tea coming into Boston Harbor, that this set off a complaint of taxation without representation, undue regulation of the colonials as to who they could trade with, both among the colonies as well as with the rest of the world and outside the British Empire, that they viewed it oppressive for the government to restrict their freedom of speech and press, to set up representatives to reflect the power of the king in opposition to the local citizenry. And that today we're paying almost half of the income we earn just to subsidize the needs, the wants, the desires, the insistences of the government, plus all the regulatory burdens, which are estimated to be uh, about $2 trillion a year to meet business, to meet compliance costs of government federal regulations, including the paperwork. This is outrageous. This should be a new American revolution, calling for a cut in taxes matched by an equivalent downsize of government spending, so that we could return to an America closer to the one that you were talking about. Let us keep in mind every dollar, every penny that the government taxes away from you and me is a dollar less that the earner of that dollar or penny has to spend as he desires it. The consumer goods that would satisfy your family's needs or desires or hopes or wishes or pleasures, the amount of savings that some of those tax dollars, if it had not been taken, would have been permitted for you to do, putting down more money in a savings account for a home you want to have, or a car you'd like to purchase, or your child's college education, or just some dream vacation that you and your spouse, or as they say today, significant other, might want to go on for some special anniversary occasion. Uh, all of this is limited, retarded, constrained, and narrowed because of the amount of the income that individuals have peacefully and honestly earned in the marketplace that the government just siphons off through the compulsory power of taxation. Now, the fact is that if you don't pay your taxes, the government will threaten to do bad things to your body. If you don't file and the government concludes that you've not filed your taxes, you'll get a notice in the mail. And if you ignore that notice, there'll be a second or maybe even a third notice. But at some point, they're going to say that you have to show up at their office with the appropriate documentation to show why you shouldn't have paid your taxes. If you ignore that, again, at some point, an IRS agent, possibly with a U.S. Marshal, is going to come to your door, knock on your door, and say, for taxes that you've not paid, your home is being confiscated by the government to pay back taxes. Now, if at that point, Jacob, you were to say, but why are you taxing me? I'm not interested in welfare redistribution. I'm not interested in foreign wars. I'm not interested in that. Now, if you gave me a bill for the type of size and expense of government that the founding fathers talked about, the protection of life and liberty and private property, and a judicial system to back that up, send me a bill for that, and I'm most likely to pay it. But I'm not interested in the welfare statist interventionist largesse that you want to siphon out of my honestly earned money for purposes and causes that I don't agree with. Now, the marshal will say, sir, that is an interesting philosophic perspective, but this house is now the property of the government for back taxes. But I'm not leaving my house. Sir, if you do not vacate the premises, I will be forced to put you under arrest. Why are you arresting me? I'm an honest person. I've earned every dollar honestly. I've not killed, I've not stolen, I've not defrauded. Every dollar I've earned is in a peaceful, voluntary exchange with other fellow Americans. Why are you doing this to me? Sir, I'm now pulling out my handcuffs. You're not putting handcuffs on me. I'm an honest, law-abiding citizen. I've not broken one law. Just leave me alone. Who did I kill? Who did I steal from? Who did I defraud? Sir, you are now under arrest. I'm not. Sir, I'm pulling my gun out now. And if you don't calmly submit to my putting the handcuffs on, I'm going to have to use physical force to subdue you. You're not subduing me. What did I do wrong? I'm an honest, peaceful citizen. I haven't harmed a fly. Sir, I'm warning you. Stop waving your arms at me, or I will have to view that as a threat. And then if he feels threatened sufficiently, there are legal circumstances in which he has a right to shoot you dead for not having paid your taxes. Now, the one question that I've often asked, and I rarely find any person willing to give an answer who believes in the government doing all these things, I said, why is that person's freedom or life worth less than the tax money you want to take from him to pay for Aunt Minnie's government subsidized apartment or Johnny's government subsidized dental appointment? Why? Why is their redistributive welfare programs more important or have a higher moral standing than that person's life and property and honestly earned income? By what right do you say that you're going to force him, Peter, to give his part of his wealth to Paul, regardless of whether he views it as a desirable, meritorious, or worthwhile, which he might do as a voluntary contribution if he thought that it was deserving? That question is never answered. Why is Aunt Minnie's apartment subsidized by the government of greater value than that man's freedom or the property that's been taken from him? That's the moral issue that is never confronted.
Yeah, and they act like that this system means that everybody's good, caring, and compassionate. I mean, here is a system that relies on the force of the IRS, as you've described, and which is one of the most feared and tyrannical agencies in the history of this country, to confiscate wealth with intimidation, threat of force, threat of incarceration, threat of killing. And people say, oh, Jacob, this shows you what a good, caring, benevolent society we are. Well, that's just pure nonsense. Good, caring, and benevolence and compassion can only come from the willing, voluntary heart of the individual. When a child sees a parent is in need, needs an operation, ailing, there are few things more gratifying in life than to help your parents out when they really need help. To kind of say, hey, we're family, and thank you for everything you've done for me, and now I want to repay you and help you out. Very gratifying in terms of family values. I guarantee you there is not one iota of gratification that comes from supporting the IRS seizure of money in order that the Social Security Administration or the Medicare people send the money to their parents. And the other thing on your force that you mentioned, I was reminded as I was hearing you talk about Irwin Schiff. Irwin Schiff was a big tax resistor, but what really infuriated the feds was not that he wasn't paying his taxes; it was that he was writing books that were advising people why they didn't need to pay their taxes, why the income taxation was not legal or moral or constitutional. And regardless of what you think about his arguments, the fact is that in a society based on freedom of speech, you got a right to tell people whatever they want. They go make the decisions on whether they're going to accept his advice or not. Well, boy, that infuriated them because you see, he's a threat to the hive. He's now not only not paying his fair share, but he's telling other drones. Hey, you don't need to be paying. So they locked him up in a federal penitentiary. I forget how old he was, but I think he was in his 70s, but they effectively gave him a life sentence. And he got cancer while he was in the penitentiary, and he asked for an early release so that he could die with his family. And do you know that they said no? I mean, they treated him like he was this violent criminal that had murdered tons of people or something. All this guy had done was publish some books on tax avoidance or evasion or whatever and hadn't paid taxes. And they said, no, you will die here in this prison. And that's exactly where he died. The other thing, Richard, is the economic aspect. You know, this is the disaster that a lot of people just don't realize. I mean, Adam Smith in 1776 comes up with this concept that if government stays out of people's wealth, income, and economic activities, the standard of living of people will soar. It was really the key to abolishing or greatly alleviating poverty that had existed throughout the ages. The American people put that system into play, except for slaves, which is a horrific exception. Everybody acknowledges that. But everybody else, by the time the late 1800s come along, you have this unbelievable increase in the standard of living. But there's a reason for it. And that is because people saved a large portion of their income. And why were they saving it? Because they kept everything they earned. So they could do the things they liked and still had a bunch left over. That savings goes into banks. Their employers, the farmer, for example, says, hey, I want to borrow some money to go get a tractor or some tractors from my farm. And the banker says, well, I'll be darned. We have some money here to lend you. People have saved their money. So the farmer takes this tractor and increases the productivity of his farm workers from 100 bushels a year to 1,000 bushels a year. Well, that increase in productivity then provides the means by which wage rates start rising through the competitive process. That's what's raising standards of living, along with trade. That people realize that when you're trading with others, your standard of living is increasing also because you're giving up something you value less for something you value more. In other words, Americans discovered the key to relieving, if not ending, poverty. And we abandoned that trajectory, or the 20th century Americans abandoned that trajectory in 1913 with the income tax, which, as you say, now confiscates close to 5 months, 6 months of a person's earnings. And that's what is the great impediment to the rising standards of living of the American people at this point.
Yeah, the thing to keep in mind is that uh, this is all due ultimately to the ideological shift that began to happen in that closing period that you so admire. The institutions are in place and people's actions continued to follow it into the 20th century. But tragically, the intellectual climate of opinion had begun to change already in the 1880s and 1890s. The idea that the collective comes before the individual, that the state must paternalistically care for large segments of the population to be funded by others in the society, that it is the duty and the responsibility of the government to direct and harness the activities of members of society into those directions that the political authorities, those who are in power, decide serves the interests of the United States better than allowing individuals to make these decisions for themselves. Once you had that ideological shift, I would suggest, it became, quote, inevitable that there would be the need for greater funds to be able to provide the financial wherewithal for government to perform all these duties and activities. And clearly, the way the government collected revenues before the income tax amendment of 1913 was through land sales. The federal government still owns large swaths of territory all across the United States, particularly in the West, obviously, still in Alaska. They would be selling land, and that was a source of revenue. They had excise taxes on certain, what we would call sin taxes, alcohol, tobacco. And then there were import duties. Now, America had a roller coaster history of free trade, protectionism, free trade. But the fact is that when the income tax amendment came in, it was basically the tariffs were relatively low and were meant as a funding source for the government, a revenue source, and not necessarily a trade restricting force to protect domestic producers. But once the government needed this additional money for government regulation, redistribution, a growing bureaucracy to handle the interventionist welfare state, they had to find a source of revenue far greater than those earlier ones could provide in sufficient amount. And that source was the income tax. And in spite of in the 19th century attempts to impose an income tax and twice having it declared unconstitutional, they followed the route of the amendment to the Constitution and therefore embedded the power of the government to directly take our income for its purposes that has become the burdensome evil that continues to plague the country.
Yeah, that your point about the shift in public opinion is very interesting. That shift was starting in the late 1800s, where people were advocating the adoption of socialist programs. And if you look at, for example, in Germany, in the 1880s, the German people adopted Social Security and national health care, which were socialist programs. Everybody understood they were socialist programs, but the people in the United States said, we don't want to have anything to do with that. I mean, they were experiencing this phenomenal degree of wealth creation. We don't want to have anything to do with that socialist philosophy. But as you said, the statists were starting to percolate. They had gone to Germany to study some of the intellectuals. They were bringing back the ideas. And by the time the 1930s come along, it shows you how different generations can think. That you have an entirely new group of Americans, the children or the grandchildren of the people in the 1880s, that said, we love socialism, as long as it's not called socialism. So you have this wholesale transformation in thinking to the point where Adolf Hitler, who was battling the Great Depression in Germany in the 1930s and was admired within many circles for what he was doing to bring Germany back in the 1930s. Uh, he sent a letter to Franklin Roosevelt commending Roosevelt on his economic policies. And he said in the letter, you get it. It's the public weal, the public benefit before the selfish interests of the individual. And he was absolutely right, Richard, because that's exactly what this whole philosophy was, is that it's the beehive philosophy, that the greater good of the collective is what matters, not the selfish interests of the individual trying to keep his money and decide for himself what to do with it. I also think it's worth pointing out that okay, how did they get Americans to adopt this thing? That's what's just so amazing to me. Here you have an income tax-free society for more than 100 years. How do you convince people to give up that freedom? And what they did was they said, well, this is going to be an income tax, but only on the rich. Nobody else has to worry. It's just going to be only on the rich. And on the rich, it's only going to be a tiny percentage, 1 or 2%. Nobody really needs to worry, including the rich. But they didn't put those limitations into the amendment. They just said, trust us. And so Americans trust them. And of course, here we are, where the middle class is just devastated with income taxation. The rich are usually able to figure out ways to avoid paying income taxes. And to a certain extent, Richard, poor people pay a large portion of their income as well. It's a relative thing. When you're making less money, it sometimes hurts when you're losing 30 to 40% of it. Uh, but that's how they got it. I mean, they just essentially defrauded the Americans into supporting this thing.
Yeah, interestingly enough, on this point that you were just making, there used to be a weekly news magazine called Literary Digest in the early part of the 20th century. Sort of an early version of what we would call like what used to be called Newsweek magazine, Time magazine. And about the time that the income tax amendment was being passed in terms of the amendment, the 16th Amendment, Literary Digest had an article, I actually looked it up and read it, in which there was a concern that once this was embedded in the law, there was the danger that government would actually reach the heights of confiscation of wealth. Why, it might reach as high as 5% of people's income. How could the country survive? They're going to confiscate 50% of people's earned incomes. Oh, now, I would consider that I'd be living in a land of economic paradise if the government was only taking 5% of my income compared to this tax freedom day on June 12th, when I will have spent almost half of the year working for the damn government.
Yeah, I remember that when that tax freedom day not too long ago was in May. I mean,
Yeah.
every year they just take more and more and more. One of I know we're about out of time, but I want to emphasize one of the books that has been really influential for both of us. When I first discovered the libertarian movement many years ago, one of the books I discovered was The Income Tax, Root of All Evil by Frank Shodoroff. And I'm sure you can still find used copies on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, and it really is worth getting. It's just a masterful piece. Shodorov was a individualist writer in the 1950s, and this book is just fantastic in terms of showing that the income tax really is the root of all evil, Richard.
I should just mention that you don't even have to go through used bookstores. If you do a Google search, it might even be from the Mises Institute, but you can go online and download a free PDF of
Uh,
the income tax, the root of all evil. I might also recommend, because I believe that Chota was an unbelievably clear, principled, and delightful writer on liberty, that there's another book of his, and I believe it's also downloadable at the Mises Institute site, called The Rise and Fall of Society. And it's all about how the state has grown and swallowed up all of this through the ages in different societies. So Income Tax, the Root of All Evil, and The Rise and Fall of Society, both classics by Frank Shodorov.
okay, on that fine note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all again for tuning in, and thanks for your support of FFF. And if you're brand new to us, go ahead and subscribe to our FFF Daily. That's free. And if you like our work, we hope you'll become one of our financial supporters. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.